This is Greece, late summer, 480 BC. The sun beats down on a narrow coastal pass between mountain and sea, a place where the cliffs rise so steeply that the pathway between stone and water measures barely 50 feet across at its narrowest point. The Greeks call this place Thermopylae, the hot gates, named for the thermal springs that bubble up from the earth nearby, steam rising in the morning cool, the smell of sulfur hanging faintly in the air. For thousands of years, this pass has been one of the few routes from northern Greece into the heartland, a natural choke point where geography itself becomes a weapon. And now, in this late summer of 480 BC, this narrow passage is about to become the stage for one of history's most famous last stands. To the north, stretching back for miles along the coastal road, comes an army unlike anything Greece has ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of men, some ancient sources claim as many as 2 million, though modern historians suggest something closer to 100,000 to 300,000. But even at the lower estimates, this is an invasion force of staggering scale. Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Indians, Ethiopians, Scythians, warriors from dozens of nations across the vast Persian Empire, all marching under the banner of one man, Xerxes, King of Kings, the ruler of the largest empire the world has yet known. This army has been years in the making. It has crossed the Hellespont on bridges of boats, consumed the resources of entire regions just to feed itself on the march. And now it advances south with the clear intention of conquering all of Greece and bringing it into the Persian fold. Standing in that narrow pass at Thermopylae, blocking the way, is a force so small by comparison that it seems almost absurd. Roughly 7,000 Greek soldiers, give or take, drawn from various city-states across Greece. And at their center, holding the narrowest point of the pass, are 300 Spartans under the command of their king, Leonidas. 300 men against an empire. The disparity is not just numerical. It represents a clash of worlds, of philosophies, of everything that separates the Greek way of life from the Persian model of absolute monarchy. This is not merely a battle. This is a confrontation between freedom and subjugation, between the Greek ideal of the citizen soldier and the Persian reality of subject peoples fighting for a distant king. For 3 days, these Greeks will hold this pass. For 3 days, they will transform geography into advantage, discipline into power, and courage into legend. The Persians will throw wave after wave of troops against the Greek line, and each time they will be thrown back with devastating losses. The Persian king Xerxes will watch in growing frustration and disbelief as his vast army proves unable to dislodge a handful of Greeks from a strip of land so narrow that numbers cease to matter. This is the story of how those 3 days unfolded. This is the story of how a doomed stand became immortal. This is the story of Thermopylae. But before we dive into the blood and dust and desperate fighting of those August days, we need to understand how the Greeks and Persians arrived at this point. We need to understand who these men were, what drove them to this confrontation, and why this particular pass, at this particular moment, became the hinge upon which the fate of Western civilization would swing. Let us step back then, to the years and decades before Thermopylae, to understand the world that produced this battle and the men who fought it. The story of Thermopylae begins, not in Greece, but in Persia, in the heart of an empire that stretched from the Aegean Sea to India, from the deserts of Egypt to the steppes of Central Asia. This was the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and by 480 BC, it was the undisputed superpower of the known world. The Persians had built this empire through a combination of military prowess, administrative genius, and a surprising degree of tolerance for the customs and religions of conquered peoples. Unlike many empires before or since, the Persians generally allowed subject peoples to maintain their own ways of life, their own gods, their own local governance, as long as they paid tribute and provided troops when called upon. This pragmatic approach had allowed Persia to absorb dozens of different cultures and ethnicities into a remarkably stable imperial structure. The empire had been founded by Cyrus the Great around 550 BC, a ruler remembered even by his enemies as wise and just. Cyrus conquered the Median Empire, then the Lydian Empire, then Babylon itself, creating in a single generation a realm larger than any that had come before. His son Cambyses added Egypt to the empire, and when internal troubles threatened to tear the empire apart after Cambyses' death, a nobleman named Darius seized power, crushed the rebellions, and reorganized the entire imperial structure into a system of provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap who answered directly to the king. Under Darius, the Persian Empire reached its height of power and efficiency. Roads connected the far-flung provinces. A postal system allowed messages to travel from one end of the empire to the other with remarkable speed. The famous royal road stretched from Sardis in Asia Minor to Susa in Persia, over 1,600 miles, and couriers could cover the distance in about a week. The empire was rich beyond measure, drawing tribute from Egypt's grain, Babylon's wealth, and the gold mines of Asia Minor. But there was one region that troubled Darius, one area that refused to accept Persian dominion with the same resignation as so many others: Greece. Or more precisely, the Greek cities on the western coast of Asia Minor, in the region the Greeks called Ionia. These cities, Greek in culture and language, had fallen under Persian control when Cyrus conquered Lydia decades earlier. Most had accepted Persian rule without too much fuss. They paid their tribute, provided ships for the Persian navy, and otherwise continued their lives much as before. But in 4999 BC, these Ionian cities rose in revolt. The reasons were complex: a mixture of political grievances, economic pressures, and the fundamental Greek distaste for being ruled by a foreign king. The revolt was led by Aristagoras of Miletus, and it spread rapidly through the Ionian cities. The rebels knew they could not stand alone against Persia. They sent envoys across the Aegean to mainland Greece, begging for help. Most of the Greek city-states refused. Sparta, the most powerful military state in Greece, declined to send aid, arguing that fighting Persia so far from home was folly. But two cities responded. Athens sent 20 ships. Eretria sent 5. It was not much, but it was something. The Athenian ships sailed to Asia Minor and joined the rebels in a daring raid on Sardis, the Persian provincial capital. They stormed the city and set it ablaze. The satrap's palace burned. The flames consumed much of the lower city. The attack was meant to inspire other subject peoples to revolt, to show that Persia could be defied. Instead, it sealed the fate of the rebellion and guaranteed Persian retaliation against mainland Greece. Darius crushed the Ionian revolt methodically and brutally. City by city, the Persians reconquered the rebellious regions. Miletus, the heart of the revolt, was besieged, captured, and destroyed. Its men were killed, its women and children sold into slavery, its ruins left as a warning. By 494 BC, the revolt was over. Persian control was restored. But Darius did not forget the aid that Athens and Eretria had provided. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Darius ordered a servant to remind him 3 times at every dinner, "Master, remember the Athenians." Whether this story is literally true or not, it captures a truth about what followed. Persia would not forgive Greek interference. Persia would make Greece pay. In 492 BC, Darius sent an army under his son-in-law Mardonius to punish the Greeks. The expedition got as far as Thrace and Macedonia before being forced to turn back due to storms that destroyed much of the Persian fleet and attacks by local tribes. 2 years later, in 490 BC, Darius tried again. This time, he sent a naval expedition directly across the Aegean, targeting Athens and Eretria specifically. The Persians landed on the island of Euboea, besieged Eretria, and after several days captured and burned the city, exacting revenge for its role in the Ionian revolt. Then, the Persian fleet crossed to the Attic coast and landed at Marathon, a plain about 25 miles northeast of Athens. The Athenians, heavily outnumbered, marched out to meet them. The Spartans had been asked for help, but replied that religious obligations prevented them from marching until the full moon. So Athens stood essentially alone, with only a small contingent from the nearby city of Plataea fighting alongside them. At the Battle of Marathon, the Athenians charged the Persian line in one of the most famous battles in history. Against all odds, the Greek phalanx shattered the Persian center and wings, drove the invaders back to their ships, and killed thousands of Persian soldiers for minimal Greek losses. The Persians sailed away, defeated. Athens had proven that Persia could be beaten. But Marathon did not end the threat. Darius began preparing for another invasion, this time on a much larger scale. He would not simply send an expeditionary force. He would bring the full weight of the empire to bear. He would conquer Greece once and for all and absorb it into Persia as just another satrapy. But before he could launch this new campaign, Darius died in 486 BC. His throne passed to his son, Xerxes. Xerxes inherited not just his father's empire, but also his father's unfinished business. The new King of Kings was in his mid-30s, vigorous, intelligent, and determined to surpass his father's accomplishments. Xerxes spent the first years of his reign consolidating power, putting down a rebellion in Egypt, crushing unrest in Babylon, and preparing for the great enterprise that would define his kingship, the invasion of Greece. But Xerxes understood that this could not be a half-hearted effort. To succeed where his father had stumbled, Xerxes would need to assemble an army and navy larger than any ever gathered. He would need to plan logistics on an unprecedented scale. He would need to solve the fundamental problem that had plagued previous invasions, the difficulty of supplying a large army as it moved through regions that could not feed it. For 4 years, from 484 to 480 BC, the Persian Empire prepared for war. Across the vast territories of the empire, levies were raised. Every satrapy was ordered to provide troops. The core of the army would be Persian and Median soldiers, the elite fighters of the empire. But there would also be contingents from dozens of other peoples: Egyptians, Phoenicians, Bactrians, Indians, Scythians, Thracians, each bringing their own styles of warfare, their own weapons, their own traditions. Herodotus, writing decades later, would list 46 different nations in Xerxes' army, a claim that is probably exaggerated but captures the reality that this was an army drawn from across the known world. The Persian navy, too, was assembled, with hundreds of ships contributed by the Phoenicians, Egyptians, and Ionians. These were triremes, sleek warships powered by 3 banks of oars, capable of high speed and ramming attacks. The Persian fleet would eventually number somewhere between 600 and 1,200 ships. Sources vary, but it was certainly the largest naval force ever assembled in the ancient world up to that point. But ships and soldiers were only part of the problem. How do you feed an army of hundreds of thousands as it marches through regions that cannot possibly support it? Xerxes' solution was to stockpile supplies at strategic points along the invasion route. For months before the army marched, Persian administrators arranged for grain, dried meat, wine, and other provisions to be collected and stored in magazines along the planned line of march. The cities and peoples of Thrace and Macedonia, regions through which the army would pass, were required to contribute food. Even so, the logistical challenge was immense. Ancient sources report that entire regions were bankrupted by the need to feed the Persian army for even a single day. There was also the problem of the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separates Asia from Europe, modern-day Dardanelles. Xerxes could not ferry his entire army across in ships. it would take too long and leave his forces vulnerable. Instead, he ordered the construction of two massive pontoon bridges. Ships were anchored side by side across the strait, connected by cables made of flax and papyrus, with planks laid across to form a roadway. The first set of bridges was destroyed by a storm, and according to Herodotus, Xerxes was so enraged that he ordered the Hellespont itself to be whipped and branded, as if punishing the sea for its disobedience. Whether or not this story is true, it illustrates the Greek perception of Xerxes as a man of absolute power, accustomed to having nature itself bend to his will. New bridges were built, stronger this time, and in the spring of 480 BC, the Persian army began to cross. The crossing itself took 7 days and 7 nights, a continuous stream of humanity and animals flowing from Asia into Europe. Xerxes supposedly sat on a throne overlooking the strait, watching his army cross, and according to legend, he wept at the thought that in 100 years, all these men would be dead. It is a humanizing moment in the sources, a reminder that beneath the title of King of Kings was a man who understood mortality. But whatever tears Xerxes shed, they did not slow his march. The army continued west along the Thracian coast, following the route that had been prepared, consuming the stockpiled supplies, and steadily making its way toward Greece. The Greeks, of course, knew the Persians were coming. It would have been impossible not to. The preparation for such an invasion could not be hidden. Greek spies in Asia Minor sent word of the massive army being assembled. Refugees from the regions through which the Persians marched brought news of the host's size and composition. By the spring of 480 BC, every Greek city-state understood that an invasion of unprecedented scale was imminent. The question was, what would they do about it? Greece in 480 BC was not a unified nation. It was a collection of independent city-states, each with its own government, its own interests, its own alliances and rivalries. Some were democracies, like Athens. Some were oligarchies, ruled by a small elite. Some, like Sparta, had unique systems that defied easy categorization. These city-states, or polis, as the Greeks called them, were fiercely protective of their autonomy. They shared a common language, religion and culture. They all worshipped the same gods, competed in the same Olympic Games, and read the same epic poems, but politically, they had no overarching unity. Wars between Greek city-states were common. Athens and Sparta, though both powerful, often found themselves on opposite sides of disputes. The idea of all Greeks uniting against a common enemy was not something that came naturally. Yet the threat of Persia was so overwhelming that it forced a degree of cooperation. In 481 BC, representatives from 31 Greek city-states met at the Isthmus of Corinth to discuss the crisis. This Congress of Corinth, as it became known, was a remarkable achievement. Bitter enemies agreed to set aside their feuds, at least temporarily, to face the Persian threat. Athens and Sparta, despite their mutual distrust, agreed to work together. Sparta, as the preeminent military power of Greece, was given overall command of the Greek forces, both land and sea. This was a significant concession by Athens, which by this time had a larger navy. But the Athenians understood that without Spartan leadership and the respect it commanded, the alliance would fall apart. The Greeks sent envoys throughout the Greek world, trying to rally support. Some city-states joined, others refused, preferring to hedge their bets or believing resistance was futile. Some even chose to side with Persia, offering earth and water, the traditional symbols of submission. The Greeks who did choose to resist called themselves the Hellenic League, and they faced the daunting task of defending a divided peninsula against the might of the Persian Empire. Their strategy was shaped by geography. Greece is a rugged, mountainous land, and there are only a few routes through which a large army can pass. If the Greeks could block these routes, they might slow or even stop the Persian advance. buying time for the Greek cities to prepare, for alliances to solidify, for the Persian supply lines to stretch thin. The key was choosing the right place to make a stand. The most obvious defensive position was the Isthmus of Corinth, the narrow strip of land connecting the Peloponnese to the rest of Greece. If the Greeks held the isthmus, they could prevent the Persians from reaching the heartland of Sparta, Corinth, and the other major states of the Peloponnese. But defending only the isthmus meant abandoning all of central and northern Greece to the Persians. Athens and many other cities would be left to their fate. The Athenians, understandably, found this unacceptable. They argued that the Greeks should fight farther north, defending all of Greece, not just the Peloponnese. A compromise was reached. The Greeks would attempt to hold two defensive lines. First, they would send a force to defend the Vale of Tempe in northern Thessaly, blocking the Persians before they even entered central Greece. And if that position proved untenable, as it quickly did, the Greeks would fall back to a second position, Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. That narrow pass between mountain and sea, the place where a small force could hold back a vastly larger army, at least for a while. The pass of Thermopylae was about halfway between Thessaly and Athens, on the main road south. It was the natural place to make a stand. If the Greeks could hold Thermopylae, they could prevent the Persian army from advancing. And if the Greek navy could simultaneously hold the straits near the island of Euboea at a place called Artemisium, they could prevent the Persian fleet from outflanking the army by sea. The two battles, Thermopylae on land and Artemisium at sea, would have to be fought simultaneously, each depending on the other. If either position fell, the other would become untenable. The Spartans were given responsibility for commanding the land force at Thermopylae, and to lead that force, they chose one of their two kings, Leonidas. This choice is worth pausing over because it tells us something about how seriously the Spartans took this mission, and how they understood what was at stake. Sparta had a unique political system. Unlike most Greek city-states, which had a single leader or a council of leaders, Sparta had two hereditary kings from two different royal families, ruling simultaneously. In theory, both kings had equal power, though in practice, one often dominated. The kings commanded in war, presided over religious ceremonies, and held significant influence in the Spartan assembly, though they were constrained by the ephors, 5 elected officials who held considerable power. When Sparta went to war, typically one king stayed home to manage affairs, while the other led the army. In 480 BC, Sparta's two kings were Leonidas of the Agiad family and Leotychidas of the Eurypontid family. Leonidas was probably in his 50s, a mature man with decades of military experience. He had not been born to rule. He was a younger son, and under normal circumstances, he would never have been king. But his older half-brother, King Cleomenes, had gone mad, died under mysterious circumstances, some say suicide, others say murder, and left no male heir. Leonidas, as the next in line, became king. By all accounts, he was a capable, level-headed leader, respected by his fellow Spartans. When the decision was made to send a force to Thermopylae, it was Leonidas who would command. But here is where things get complicated. Sparta was in the middle of a religious festival, the Carneia, a month-long celebration in honor of Apollo. During the Carneia, Spartans were forbidden from marching to war. It was a sacred prohibition, taken extremely seriously. This was the same religious obligation that had prevented Sparta from sending timely aid to Athens at Marathon 10 years earlier, and the Athenians had not forgotten. Now, with the Persians advancing and the crisis reaching its peak, Sparta was once again constrained by religious law. The full Spartan army could not march until the Carneia ended. But the Greeks at Thermopylae needed Spartan leadership now. so a compromise was devised. Leonidas would take a small advance force, just 300 men, all of them full Spartan citizens, and march immediately to Thermopylae. They would hold the pass until the festival ended, and the main Spartan army could follow. In theory, this was a temporary measure. The 300 would be reinforced by thousands of other Greeks, and then by the full Spartan army once the Carneia ended. But there is a detail that suggests Leonidas and the Spartan leadership understood this might be a one-way mission. The 300 men Leonidas selected were not chosen randomly. They were all men who had living sons. In Spartan culture, a man's primary duty was to produce the next generation of warriors. By choosing only men with sons, Leonidas ensured that the bloodlines of these families would continue even if the men died. It was a grim calculation, but a practical one. The Spartans were preparing for the possibility that the 300 might not return. Leonidas and his 300 marched out of Sparta in the late summer of 480 BC. As they traveled north, other Greek contingents joined them. Troops from Thebes, though Thebes' loyalty was suspect, some Thebans favored surrender to Persia. Soldiers from Phocis and Locris, regions that lay near the pass and had the most to lose if the Persians broke through. Helots, the enslaved people of Sparta, were also brought along to serve as attendants and support. By the time Leonidas reached Thermopylae, he commanded a force of somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 men. The sources vary. It was a respectable force, but tiny compared to the Persian army now marching south toward them. The pass of Thermopylae itself is worth describing in detail, because the geography determined everything that followed. Imagine a narrow strip of land, squeezed between the towering cliffs of Mount Kallidromos to the south and the waters of the Malian Gulf to the north. In 480 BC, before centuries of silt deposition moved the coastline farther north, this pass was even narrower than it is today. At its tightest point, the pass was perhaps 50 feet wide, maybe less. The ancient road ran right along the coast, and in places the sea came so close to the cliffs that an army could not deploy in any formation. They had to march through in a column. This was the middle gate, the center of the pass, the place where the Greeks would make their stand. To the west of the middle gate, the pass widened slightly at a place called the West Gate. To the east, it widened again at the East Gate, but the middle gate was the key. Hold that, and you hold the pass. The Greeks set up their defenses at the middle gate. Leonidas's men rebuilt an old Phocian wall that had once stood there, stacking stones to create a barrier across the narrowest part of the pass. This wall was not high, perhaps waist height, but it did not need to be. It was a marker, a line in the sand, a place for the Greek phalanx to anchor its shields. Behind the wall, the Greeks made camp. The Spartans, naturally, took the place of honor at the very center of the line. The other Greek contingents spread out to either side and served in rotation. Nearby, the hot springs that gave the pass its name bubbled up from the ground, steam rising in the cool morning air, the smell of sulfur, a constant presence. The Greeks could bathe in the warm water, a small comfort before the fighting to come. And then they waited. They knew the Persians were close. Scouts had brought word of the massive army advancing down the coast. Any day now the Persians would arrive. The Greeks had done everything they could to prepare. They had chosen their ground. They had built their defenses. They had committed themselves to holding this pass for as long as possible, to buy time for the rest of Greece. Some of the Greeks must have wondered if the Spartan reinforcements would arrive in time. Some must have wondered if this would be their last stand. But they were Greeks, and they had agreed to be here, and now there was nothing to do but wait for the Persians to come into view around the bend of the coast. The Persian army reached the area around Thermopylae in early August, 480 BC. The exact date is uncertain, Ancient sources are not precise, but it was late in the summer when the heat was at its peak and the dust from thousands of marching feet hung thick in the air. When the scouts reported to Xerxes that a Greek force was blocking the pass, the King of Kings must have been puzzled. His army outnumbered the Greeks by perhaps 50 to 1, possibly more. Why would anyone stand in the path of such overwhelming force? It seemed less like a military decision and more like a gesture of futility. Xerxes made camp and sent a scout to observe the Greeks and assess their numbers. The scout rode forward carefully, approaching the pass from the western side. As he drew near the Greek position, he could see the Phocian wall across the narrow point, and behind it, the Greek soldiers. What he saw must have confused him. Some of the Greeks were exercising, some were combing their hair. They were Spartans, and they were preparing themselves according to their customs, grooming their long hair, as was traditional before battle, treating the coming fight with a ritualistic calm. The scout watched for a while, counted what he could see, and then rode back to Xerxes with his report. The Greeks, he said, were few in number, and they were combing their hair. Xerxes, according to Herodotus, did not know what to make of this. He summoned Demaratus, an exiled Spartan king who had fled to Persia years earlier and now served as an advisor to Xerxes, and asked him to explain. Demaratus told Xerxes that the Spartans were preparing to die. When Spartans combed their hair before battle, it was a sign they expected not to survive. They were making themselves presentable for their entry into the afterlife. They would fight to the last man. Xerxes supposedly laughed at this. The idea that a few hundred men would choose to die rather than surrender seemed absurd. Surely once the Greeks saw the size of the Persian army, they would flee or submit. Xerxes decided to wait. He gave the Greeks 4 days to disperse, 4 days to come to their senses and realize the futility of resistance. During those 4 days, the two armies faced each other across the narrow pass, separated by a distance of perhaps half a mile. The Persians made camp in the wider area west of the pass, their tents stretching back along the coast in an endless sea of fabric and banners. Cook fires sent up columns of smoke. The Persians watered their horses in the Spercheios River nearby, and according to Herodotus, there were so many men and animals that the river ran dry before they finished. Whether literally true or not, the detail captures the overwhelming scale of the Persian host. From the Greek position, the Persians must have seemed like an inexhaustible tide, a force of nature rather than an army of men. The Greeks, for their part, remained calm. Leonidas held council with his officers, reviewing the plan, ensuring everyone understood their role. There was debate among the Greeks. Some of the Peloponnesian contingents, men from cities near Sparta, began to waver. They argued that the position was too exposed, that the force was too small, that they should retreat to the Isthmus of Corinth and defend there. The Phocians and Locrians, whose lands would be the first to be overrun if Thermopylae fell, vehemently opposed this. They argued that abandoning Thermopylae meant abandoning them. Leonidas sided with the Phocians and Locrians. They would hold the pass. They would make the Persians pay for every foot of ground. The debate ended, and the Greeks settled in to wait for the Persian attack. On the 5th day, Xerxes' patience ran out. The Greeks had not dispersed. They had not fled. They remained at the pass, a tiny force defying the might of the empire. Xerxes gave the order. His army would attack. They would clear these Greeks out of the way and continue the march south. The King of Kings did not expect this to take long. He assumed the Greeks would break and run once they saw Persian soldiers coming at them in force. He was about to learn otherwise. The battle began late on that 5th day. Xerxes sent forward his Median and Sicyan troops, tough soldiers from the Iranian plateau, to clear the pass. These were not the elite immortals, the cream of the Persian army, but they were experienced fighters, and there were thousands of them. They advanced along the road toward the Greek position, confident that their numbers would carry the day. The Greeks watched them come. The Spartans stood at the center, their bronze helmets gleaming, their shields locked together, their long spears leveled. They were a wall of bronze and iron, immovable. When the Persians came within range, the Greeks did not charge. They did not break formation. They simply held their ground. The Persians crashed into the Greek line like a wave hitting a cliff, and like a wave, they broke against it. The Greek phalanx was a formation perfected over generations of warfare. Each man carried a large round shield, the hoplon, about 3 feet in diameter, made of wood and bronze. The shield was held on the left arm, protecting not just the man who carried it, but also the man to his left. The phalanx was a collective defense, each man's safety dependent on his neighbor's shield. In the right hand, the Greeks carried a spear, the dory, about 7 to 9 feet long, designed for thrusting rather than throwing. The front rank of the phalanx presented a hedge of spear points, and the ranks behind added weight and pressure, pushing the front rank forward. Against this formation, the Persians were at a severe disadvantage. They carried lighter shields, often made of wicker. Their spears were shorter. They wore less armor. And in the narrow confines of the pass, they could not use their numerical superiority. Only a few dozen men could fight at the front at any given time. The pass funneled them into a killing zone, where Greek discipline and equipment gave the defenders an overwhelming advantage. The Persians pressed forward, trying to break through by sheer weight of numbers. The Greeks thrust with their spears, stabbing over and between their shields, killing or wounding anyone who came within reach. The Persians in the front ranks fought bravely, but they were cut down. Those behind pushed forward, climbing over the bodies of their comrades, only to meet the same fate. The Spartans were extraordinary fighters. They had been training for this since childhood. Spartan boys were taken from their families at age 7 and raised in communal barracks, subjected to a brutal regimen of physical training, discipline, and combat instruction. The Spartan education, the agoge, was designed to produce warriors who could endure any hardship, follow orders without question, and fight in perfect coordination with their comrades. By the time a Spartan reached manhood, he was a living weapon, conditioned to remain calm in the chaos of battle, to move in unison with his phalanx, to kill efficiently and without hesitation. At Thermopylae, the Spartans demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of their training. They fought in disciplined silence, no shouting, no breaking ranks, just the mechanical thrust and withdraw of spears, the grinding advance of the phalanx. The Persians must have felt like they were fighting a machine rather than men. The battle continued through the afternoon and into the evening. The Persians threw more and more men into the pass, but the result was always the same. The Greeks held. The dead piled up in front of the Phocian wall. The ground became slick with blood. The Persians, exhausted and demoralized, finally pulled back as the sun set. The first day of fighting was over. The Greeks had held the pass. Not a single Persian soldier had made it through. Xerxes, watching from a distance, was stunned. His army, the largest force ever assembled, had been stopped cold by a few thousand Greeks. He had lost hundreds, perhaps thousands of men, and gained nothing. On the second day, Xerxes decided to commit his elite troops. He sent in the Immortals, his personal guard, 10,000 of the best soldiers in the Persian army. They were called the Immortals because their unit was always kept at exactly 10,000 men. Whenever one was killed or retired, he was immediately replaced, so the unit seemed to never diminish. These were professional soldiers, well-equipped, well-trained, loyal to the king. If anyone could break the Greek line, it would be the immortals. They marched into the pass with confidence, expecting to succeed where the Medes and Scythians had failed. They failed too. The immortals crashed into the Greek phalanx and found it just as unyielding as the troops before them. The Greeks fought with the same disciplined ferocity, their spears finding gaps in the Persian armor, their shields holding firm against every attack. The narrowness of the pass continued to negate the Persian numerical advantage. The immortals could not outflank the Greeks, could not surround them, could not bring their superior numbers to bear. They fought and died in the same narrow killing ground as the troops who came before them. Hour after hour the battle raged. The Greeks rotated units, allowing tired men to fall back and rest, while fresh troops took their place at the wall. The Persians had no such luxury. They had to keep pressing, keep attacking, because to pull back was to admit defeat. At some point, during the second day's fighting, Leonidas and the Spartans employed a tactic that added insult to injury. They would pretend to break and run, turning and fleeing back up the pass, as if routed. The Persians, thinking they had finally broken the Greek line, would surge forward in pursuit, their formation dissolving into a disorganized mob as they chased the fleeing Greeks. And then, at a signal, the Spartans would turn, reform their phalanx in an instant, and counterattack the now disordered Persians. The feigned retreat was a classic Spartan maneuver, requiring extraordinary discipline to execute properly. You had to convince the enemy you were genuinely fleeing, which meant actually running, actually showing your back to the enemy, something that went against every instinct of a warrior. But the Spartans could do it because they trusted each other completely. They knew every man would turn at the right moment, would be in the right position, would reform the line perfectly. And when they did turn, the Persians were caught completely off guard, packed together, unable to defend themselves properly. The Spartans would plow into them, spears thrusting, and cut down dozens before the Persians could even realize what had happened. According to Herodotus, Xerxes leapt from his throne 3 times during the battle. So alarmed was he at what he was seeing. His best troops were being massacred in a narrow pass by a force a fraction of their size. The King of Kings, accustomed to having his will obeyed by nations, was being defied by a handful of Greeks who refused to acknowledge his supremacy. The psychological impact was almost as significant as the tactical failure. Xerxes had brought this massive army to intimidate as much as to conquer. The mere sight of so many soldiers was supposed to break the will of his enemies. But the Greeks at Thermopylae were not intimidated. If anything, they seemed contemptuous of the Persian numbers. They had turned the pass into a grinder, and every Persian who entered came out dead or wounded. By the end of the second day, the Persians pulled back again, having made no progress whatsoever. The Greeks still held the pass. The bodies of the dead now formed actual mounds in front of the Phocian wall. The smell of blood and death hung heavy in the August heat. Flies swarmed over the corpses. The wounded crawled or were carried back to the Persian lines, groaning in pain. The Greeks, though exhausted, were unbroken. They had proved their point. Geography and discipline could defeat even the largest army if applied correctly. But the Greeks also knew they could not hold indefinitely. They were taking casualties, fewer than the Persians, but losses nonetheless. Their weapons were breaking, spear shafts snapping, shield rims bending under the constant impact. And food and water were limited. The question was not whether they could hold forever, but whether they could hold long enough. Long enough for what? That depended on what was happening elsewhere. At the Straits of Artemisium, the Greek fleet was engaged in its own desperate battle against the Persian navy. The two battles were linked. As long as the Greeks held both Thermopylae and Artemisium, the Persians were stalled. But if either position fell, the other would become untenable. The Greek fleet had been fighting for the same 2 days as the army at Thermopylae. And they were also holding their own, but barely. The Persian fleet outnumbered them significantly, and storms had damaged both fleets, but the Greeks more so. The naval commanders were in communication with Leonidas, and there was an understanding that if one position had to be abandoned, the other would be as well. For now, both held, but time was running out. On the evening of the second day, something happened that would seal the fate of the Greeks at Thermopylae. A local Greek, a man from the region named Ephialtes, came to the Persian camp and requested an audience with Xerxes. Ephialtes had information to sell. He knew of a mountain path, a goat track that wound through the mountains behind the pass, emerging on the eastern side. If a force could be sent along this path, they could come down behind the Greek position and attack them from the rear. The Greeks would be trapped between two Persian forces, and the pass would fall. Ephialtes told Xerxes all this in exchange for a promise of reward. Xerxes was delighted. Finally, a solution to the stalemate. He immediately ordered his general Hydarnes to take the immortals and follow Ephialtes along the mountain path that very night. The path Ephialtes revealed was called the Anapeia. It was a difficult route, narrow and steep in places, unsuitable for large formations, but passable for infantry in single file. It would take hours to traverse in darkness, but if successful, it would turn the entire strategic situation. The Greeks, Leonidas specifically, were aware that such a path existed. That was why he had stationed a force of 1,000 Phocian hoplites on the mountain above the pass, specifically to guard the Anapeia and prevent exactly this kind of flanking maneuver. The Phocians were local troops who knew the terrain and who had volunteered for this duty. Their job was to hold the path, or at least warn Leonidas if the Persians attempted to use it. Late on the second night, Hydarnes and the immortals set out. They marched in darkness, guided by Ephialtes, climbing the rocky slopes of Mount Kallidromos. The night was quiet, except for the sound of thousands of feet on stone, the clink of equipment, the occasional whispered command. The Persians moved carefully, knowing that surprise was essential. As dawn began to break on the third day, the immortals were high on the mountain, approaching the part of the path where the Phocian guard was stationed. The Phocians, who had been watching the pass below but not expecting an attack from above, were caught completely by surprise when they heard the rustling of leaves and the sound of the Persian column approaching through the oak forest. The Phocians scrambled to arm themselves and form some kind of defensive line. The immortals, seeing the Greeks, loosed a volley of arrows. The Phocians, under a hail of missiles, panicked. Instead of holding their ground and fighting for the path, they retreated up the mountain to higher ground, assuming the Persians were coming specifically for them. But Hydarnes had no interest in the Phocians. His mission was to get to the eastern exit of the pass, not to engage in a mountain skirmish. The immortals ignored the Phocians and continued down the path at a rapid pace. The Phocians, realizing they had effectively abandoned their post, sent runners down the mountain to warn Leonidas, but by then it was too late to stop the Persian flanking force. Leonidas received the news in the early morning of the third day. The Persians had found the path. They were coming down behind the Greek position. In a matter of hours, perhaps by midday, the immortals would emerge on the eastern side of the pass, and the Greeks would be surrounded. The strategic situation had collapsed. Thermopylae could no longer be held. The only sensible course of action was to retreat immediately, to withdraw the entire Greek force while there was still time, and fall back to the next defensive position, perhaps the Isthmus of Corinth. Leonidas called a council of his officers to discuss what to do. The council was brief. It was clear to everyone that the position was doomed. Most of the Greek contingents prepared to leave immediately. The Thebans, the Phocians, the Locrians, they gathered their gear and began marching east, hoping to get out of the pass before the immortals cut off their retreat. Some modern historians have criticized these troops for abandoning Leonidas, but that is unfair. They were acting on Leonidas's orders. He dismissed them. He told them to go. There was no point in everyone dying here. The mission to buy time had been accomplished. The Persians had been held for 2 full days. The Greek fleet at Artemisium had been given time to fight its battle. Now the Greeks needed to preserve their forces for the next phase of the war. Staying at Thermopylae with the Persians coming from both sides was not heroism. It was suicide, and it served no tactical purpose. So Leonidas let most of the Greeks go, but Leonidas himself did not leave. Neither did his 300 Spartans. Neither did a contingent of about 700 Thespians, men from the city of Thespiae, who chose to stay even though they could have left. And neither did several hundred Thebans, though the sources suggest some of the Thebans stayed unwillingly, possibly held as hostages by Leonidas, because he distrusted Thebes' loyalty. In total, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 Greeks remained at the pass when the main force withdrew. These men knew they were staying to die. There was no illusion about their fate. The Persians would attack from the front. The Immortals would hit them from behind. They would be overwhelmed and killed. But they stayed anyway. Why? For the Spartans, the answer is rooted in their culture and their laws. Spartan warriors were taught from childhood that retreat was the greatest shame. There was a famous Spartan saying, attributed to mothers sending their sons to war, "Come back with your shield, or on it." In other words, return victorious or return dead, but do not return defeated. To abandon your position, to throw away your shield and run, was to disgrace yourself, your family, and Sparta itself. Spartans did not surrender. Spartans did not retreat. They fought and won, or they fought and died. That was the code. And Leonidas, as king and commander, embodied that code absolutely. He could not leave. To do so would be to betray everything Sparta stood for. But there was more to it than just cultural conditioning. There was also a practical calculation. If Leonidas and the Spartans withdrew, it would look like cowardice to the rest of Greece. The alliance that had been so carefully built at the Congress of Corinth might fracture. The Spartan reputation, which was the foundation of their leadership, would be damaged. But if Leonidas stayed and fought to the death, if the Spartans made a heroic last stand, then the tactical defeat would be transformed into a moral victory. The story of Thermopylae would inspire other Greeks to continue resisting. It would become proof that Persians could be fought, that they could be made to pay a terrible price, that the war was not hopeless. Leonidas understood that his death would be more valuable to Greece than his survival, and so he chose to stay. The Thespians stayed for similar reasons. They were citizen soldiers of a small city-state, and they had chosen to fight for Greek freedom. When given the chance to leave, they refused. Their commander, a man named Demophilus, reportedly said they would not abandon Leonidas while he remained. It was a matter of honor, and perhaps also a recognition that if Thermopylae fell, and all of Greece fell with it, there would be nowhere safe to retreat to anyway. Better to die here fighting than to live as a slave under Persian rule. The decision of the Thespians is often overlooked in popular retellings of Thermopylae, but it deserves recognition. These were not professional warriors like the Spartans. They were farmers and craftsmen who had taken up arms to defend their homes, and they chose death over dishonor. On the morning of the 3rd day, then, Leonidas and his remaining force prepared for the end. They knew the Immortals were coming down the mountain path. They knew Xerxes would launch another frontal assault. They knew they were going to die. But they did not wait passively. Leonidas decided to make one final attack, to kill as many Persians as possible before the end. He led his men forward, out beyond the Phocian wall, into the wider part of the pass, closer to the Persian camp. This was a complete reversal of the defensive tactics that had worked so well for 2 days. Instead of holding a narrow point and making the Persians come to them, the Greeks now attacked in the open, where the Persians could bring their numbers to bear. It was a suicide charge, and everyone involved knew it. The Greeks fell on the Persian camp with the fury of men who have nothing to lose. They pushed deep into the Persian lines, killing everyone they encountered. The Persians, caught off guard by this sudden aggression, recoiled. The Greeks were fighting not to hold ground, but simply to inflict as much damage as possible before they fell. Leonidas fought in the front rank, wielding his spear until it broke, then drawing his sword and continuing to fight. At some point in this melee, Leonidas was killed. The sources do not agree on exactly how. Some say he was struck down by a storm of arrows and spears. Others say he was killed in close combat. But he fell, and when he did, his body became the focus of an intense struggle. The Spartans would not allow their king's body to be taken. In Greek culture, recovering the bodies of the dead was a sacred duty. To leave a comrade's body on the battlefield was a terrible dishonor, and to allow the enemy to desecrate a fallen king was unthinkable. So the remaining Spartans formed a protective circle around Leonidas's corpse and fought with even greater ferocity to keep it from the Persians. 4 times, according to Herodotus, the Greeks drove the Persians back. 4 times, the Persians surged forward again. The fighting over Leonidas's body became the bloodiest part of the entire battle. 2 of Xerxes' own brothers, Persian nobles who were commanding units, were killed in this struggle. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of Persians died trying to reach the fallen king. While this was happening, the immortals who had come down the mountain path emerged on the eastern side of the pass and began closing in from behind. The Greeks, now attacked from 2 directions, pulled back to a small hill near the Phocian wall, a rise in the ground that gave them a slight defensive advantage. They formed a tight circle, shields facing outward, spears leveled, preparing for the final stand. By this point, many of their spears were broken. They fought with swords, with daggers, with the broken shafts of spears, with rocks, with their bare hands. The Persians surrounded the hill and attacked from all sides. The Greeks held as long as they could, but they were being overwhelmed. The Persians, unable to break through the Greek shield wall even now, resorted to missile fire. They stood back and loosed volley after volley of arrows into the Greek position. The Greeks, packed together on the hill, could not avoid the arrows. They fell one by one, bristling with shafts, shields too heavy with embedded arrows to lift, still fighting, still refusing to surrender. And then it was over. The last Greeks fell. The 300 Spartans were dead. The Thespians were dead. The Thebans who had stayed, or been forced to stay, tried to surrender at the end, and many were killed anyway, though some were captured and branded as slaves. The pass of Thermopylae belonged to Xerxes, but the cost had been staggering. Thousands of Persian soldiers lay dead in and around the pass. The elite immortals had been badly mauled, and the Greeks had bought the time they needed. When Xerxes toured the battlefield after the fighting ended, he saw the carnage with his own eyes. The bodies of his soldiers carpeted the ground. When he learned that Leonidas was among the Greek dead, Xerxes ordered the king's head to be cut off and his body crucified on a stake. A deliberate insult, a way of punishing Leonidas, even in death for the humiliation he had inflicted on the Persian army. This act of desecration shocked the Greeks when they heard of it, and further solidified Leonidas's status as a martyr. Years later, after the Persian wars ended and Greece was free again, the Spartans recovered Leonidas's remains and brought them home for proper burial. A stone lion was erected at Thermopylae to mark the spot where he fell, and the epitaph written by the poet Simonides became immortal. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. The Battle of Thermopylae was over, but the war was not. Xerxes had won the pass, but at such a cost that it felt less like a victory and more like a warning. The Persians marched south. They overran central Greece. They captured Athens, which had been evacuated, and burned the city to the ground in retaliation for the burning of Sardis decades earlier. The Acropolis, the temples, the houses, all went up in flames. It seemed as if Persia had won. But the Greeks had not given up. Their fleet, having withdrawn from Artemisium after learning of Thermopylae's fall, regrouped near the island of Salamis, and there, in the Straits of Salamis, just a few weeks after Thermopylae, the Greek fleet defeated the Persian navy in one of the most decisive naval battles in history. Xerxes, watching from a throne on shore as his ships were destroyed, realized that conquering Greece was going to be far more difficult than he had imagined. The next year, in 479 BC, the Persian army that remained in Greece under the command of Mardonius met the full strength of the Greek land forces at the Battle of Plataea. The Greeks, now united as they had never been before, destroyed the Persian army. Mardonius was killed. The Persian threat was ended. Greece was free. And in the wake of these victories, the Greeks looked back at Thermopylae and understood what it had meant. Those 3 days in the pass had bought time for the Greek fleet to prepare. They had shown that Persians could be beaten. They had proved that courage and discipline could stand against overwhelming numbers. Thermopylae had been a tactical defeat, but a strategic and moral victory. The legacy of Thermopylae echoed through Greek culture immediately and has continued to echo through Western civilization ever since. For the Greeks, Thermopylae became the ultimate example of arete, excellence and virtue, the ideal of the warrior who fights not for personal gain, but for the good of his community. Leonidas and his 300 became symbols of selfless sacrifice, of duty placed above life, of the free man's willingness to die rather than submit to tyranny. The battle was remembered in poetry, in monuments, in annual commemorations. The Spartans erected a statue to Leonidas in Sparta itself, showing him in full armor, and centuries later, it still stood. But the story of Thermopylae was not just Spartan propaganda. It resonated with all Greeks because it captured something fundamental about how they saw themselves in contrast to the Persians. The Greeks fought as free citizens defending their own land. The Persians, in the Greek view, fought as slaves compelled to serve a distant king. The Greeks believed that free men would always fight harder than slaves because they had something real to fight for. Thermopylae seemed to prove that belief. A tiny force of free Greeks had held off the massive army of an empire, and even though they died in the end, they had made the invaders pay a price that shook the confidence of the entire Persian expedition. The story spread beyond Greece. Roman historians like Plutarch retold it, holding up Spartan valor as an example worth emulating. In the modern era, Thermopylae has been invoked countless times as a symbol of resistance against tyranny. In the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire in the 1820s, Greek fighters deliberately evoked the memory of Leonidas. In World War II, when a British and Commonwealth force fought a desperate delaying action against the German invasion of Greece in 1941, they made their stand at Thermopylae, in the same pass, against the same strategic logic, holding long enough for the main forces to evacuate. The parallel was deliberate, and the symbolism was powerful. Today, the site of the Battle of Thermopylae is marked by memorials and monuments. The terrain has changed over the centuries. Silt from the Spercheios River has extended the coastline. So the pass is no longer as narrow as it was in 480 BC. The modern highway runs through where the ancient pass once stood, and it is difficult now to visualize just how constrained the battlefield was. But the monuments remain. There is a statue of Leonidas, standing tall, holding his spear and shield, his helmet pushed back, his expression calm and determined. There is the epitaph of Simonides, carved in stone. There is a memorial to the Thespians, often forgotten but finally honored. And there is the sense when you stand there that this is sacred ground, that something extraordinary happened here, that the world changed in this place. Thermopylae matters not because the Greeks won. They did not. It matters because of how they lost. They chose to stand in a place where they knew they would die, and they did so not out of foolish bravado, but out of a calculated recognition that their deaths would serve a greater purpose. Leonidas and his men bought time, yes, but they also bought something less tangible and more important. They bought hope. They proved to the rest of Greece that the Persians were not invincible, that they could be fought, that free men standing together could defy even the greatest empire on earth. Without Thermopylae, there might have been no Salamis, no Plataea, no Greek victory. The Greeks might have lost heart, might have given up, might have surrendered to what seemed inevitable. But after Thermopylae, surrender was no longer thinkable. The sacrifice of the 300 made continued resistance possible. That is the real victory of Thermopylae. The battle also tells us something important about the nature of courage. True courage is not the absence of fear. The Spartans at Thermopylae were not fearless. They knew exactly what was going to happen to them. They knew they were going to die, probably in great pain, far from home, and that their bodies might not even receive proper burial. They understood all of that, and they stayed anyway. That is courage. Not blind confidence, but informed choice. The decision to stand and fight when every rational calculation says you should flee. The willingness to place duty and honor above survival. The Spartans were brave, yes, but they were also committed to an ideal that was larger than themselves. They believed that some things were worth dying for, and they proved it with their lives. One detail that deserves mention is the role of the Helots in this story. The Helots were the enslaved population of Sparta, people of Greek descent who had been conquered by the Spartans centuries earlier and forced into perpetual servitude. Every Spartan hoplite at Thermopylae would have been accompanied by Helot attendants who carried supplies, prepared food, maintained equipment, and generally enabled the Spartans to focus entirely on fighting. These Helots were at Thermopylae too. They do not appear in most ancient accounts because they were considered unimportant by the standards of the time, but they were there. And when the Spartans made their final stand, at least some of those Helots must have fought and died alongside their masters. We do not know their names. We do not have their stories. But they were part of the 300, in a way. And their sacrifice deserves acknowledgement, even if history has largely forgotten them. There is also the question of Ephialtes, the man who betrayed the Greeks by revealing the mountain path. His name became synonymous with treachery in Greek culture, much like Judas in Christian tradition. According to some sources, a price was put on Ephialtes' head, and he was eventually killed years later by an unrelated dispute, though some claimed it was revenge for his betrayal. The Greeks never forgot traitors, and Ephialtes' name lived on in infamy. But his role in the story is important because it reminds us that Thermopylae was not just about heroism. It was also about the realities of war, about how plans fall apart, about how a single piece of bad luck or a single betrayal can undo all the courage and skill in the world. Leonidas did everything right. He chose the best possible defensive position. He fought brilliantly. He inspired his men to superhuman efforts. But in the end, none of it mattered because Ephialtes knew a path through the mountains. War is not fair. History is not fair. Sometimes the heroes lose. But that does not make their heroism any less real. The Persian perspective on Thermopylae is less well documented because we rely primarily on Greek sources, particularly Herodotus, for our knowledge of the battle. But we can infer some of what the Persians thought from the actions they took afterward. Xerxes continued his invasion, but the ferocity of Greek resistance clearly shook him. He expected the Greeks to collapse once they saw the size of his army. Instead, they fought harder. After Salamis, after watching his fleet destroyed in the straits, Xerxes left Greece and returned to Persia, leaving Mardonius to continue the campaign. Some historians believe Xerxes lost his nerve, that the resistance he encountered, starting at Thermopylae, convinced him that conquering Greece would cost more than it was worth. The easy victory he expected never materialized, and every step south was contested with a violence and determination that his empire, for all its size, had not anticipated. For the Persians, Thermopylae must have been a frustrating and Pyrrhic victory. Yes, they took the pass. Yes, they killed the Greeks who opposed them, but they lost thousands of their own soldiers in the process, including some of their best troops and members of the royal family. The immortals, supposedly invincible, had been mauled by a force a fraction their size. And the delay at Thermopylae had given the Greeks time to prepare their next moves. From a purely strategic standpoint, Xerxes would have been better off if Thermopylae had not been defended at all, if the Greeks had simply withdrawn and let him pass. Instead, he was forced to fight a brutal 3-day battle that cost him more than he gained. The pass was a trap, and even though the Persians won in the end, they came out of it weakened. One of the most enduring aspects of the Thermopylae story is the way it has been retold and reimagined across centuries and cultures. The battle has been the subject of paintings, sculptures, poems, novels, films, and even comic books. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects. Some focus on the military tactics, some focus on Spartan culture and the agoge, some focus on the theme of freedom versus tyranny. In the modern era, the 1962 film, The 300 Spartans, and the 2006 graphic novel and film 300 brought the story to new audiences, though both took significant liberties with historical accuracy. The comic and film versions, in particular, portrayed the Persians as monstrous and inhuman, a depiction that has been rightly criticized as xenophobic and historically inaccurate. The real Persians were not monsters. They were human beings, soldiers following orders, many of them conscripts from conquered peoples who had no personal stake in the conquest of Greece. But despite these distortions, the core of the story remains powerful. Thermopylae endures because it speaks to something universal. The idea that a small group of determined people can stand against overwhelming odds. The idea that freedom is worth fighting for. The idea that how you die can matter as much as how you live. These themes transcend any particular culture or era. They resonate with people across time because they touch on fundamental human values. And so the story of Leonidas and the 300 continues to be told, continues to inspire, continues to remind us that courage is not about being unafraid, but about doing what needs to be done despite the fear. We should also consider what did not happen because of Thermopylae. If the Greeks had not made a stand there, if they had immediately fallen back to the Isthmus of Corinth, as some wanted to do, the entire course of Western history might have been different. The Persian fleet would have had free passage down the coast. The Greeks would have been demoralized from the start. The unity forged at Thermopylae might never have solidified. And without that unity, without the belief that resistance was possible, the Greeks might have lost the war. Persia might have conquered Greece. Greek culture, which would go on to profoundly influence the Roman Empire, and through Rome, the entire Western world, might have been absorbed into the Persian Empire and diluted or lost. The philosophical traditions of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle might never have developed, or might have developed very differently under Persian rule. The democratic experiments of Athens might have been stillborn. The entire trajectory of Western civilization rests, in part, on the fact that a few thousand Greeks stood in a pass and refused to move. This is not to say that everything the Greeks did was good, or that everything the Persians did was bad. The Greeks were not perfect champions of freedom. They practiced slavery. They denied women political rights. Sparta, in particular, was an oppressive militaristic state built on the backs of the Helot population. Athens, for all its democratic ideals, would go on to build its own empire and oppress other Greeks. The Persians, conversely, were in many ways more tolerant and sophisticated than the Greeks gave them credit for. The Persian Empire allowed religious freedom, employed skilled administrators from many cultures, and maintained a level of civil order that many subject peoples appreciated. The Greco-Persian wars were not a simple clash of good versus evil. They were a conflict between different political systems, different ways of organizing society, and the Greeks won. But we should be careful about projecting modern values onto ancient conflicts or pretending that one side was wholly righteous. What we can say is that the Greek victory at Salamis and Plataea, made possible by the time bought at Thermopylae, preserved Greek independence and allowed Greek culture to develop on its own terms. And that Greek culture, with all its flaws and virtues, went on to shape the world. Philosophy, drama, mathematics, architecture, political theory. So much of what we consider the foundation of Western civilization has Greek roots, and those roots might have withered if Thermopylae had fallen on the first day, or if it had not been defended at all. So in that sense, Thermopylae matters immensely, not for the battle itself, but for what the battle enabled. In the end, the story of Thermopylae is a story about choices. Leonidas chose to stay when he could have left. The 300 chose to follow him, knowing it meant death. The Thespians chose to fight alongside them. These were free choices, made by free men, and that is what makes them meaningful. In the Persian Empire, soldiers often fought because they were compelled to, because refusal meant punishment or death, because they were subjects of an absolute monarch who could command their lives. In Greece, soldiers fought because they chose to, because they were citizens defending their own land, their own laws, their own way of life. That difference mattered. It meant that when things became desperate, when the situation seemed hopeless, the Greeks had a reason to keep fighting that went beyond fear of punishment. They were fighting for something they believed in, and that belief sustained them through Thermopylae, through Salamis, through Plataea, through all the hardships and losses, until finally they won. The Battle of Thermopylae lasted 3 days, but its impact lasted millennia. The 300 Spartans who died there became immortal in a way they could never have imagined. Their stand in that narrow pass became a defining moment in human history, a testament to the power of courage, discipline, and the free human spirit. When we remember Thermopylae today, we are not just remembering a battle. We are remembering an ideal, the ideal that some things are worth dying for, the ideal that freedom is not free, that it must be defended, sometimes at great cost, the ideal that how we face death defines us as much as how we live. Leonidas and his men faced death with their eyes open, with full knowledge of what was coming, and they did not flinch. That is why we remember them. That is why their story still resonates, 25 centuries after the last Spartan fell, on that small hill in the pass of the Hot Gates. The sun set on the 3rd day of battle at Thermopylae, and with it set the lives of the bravest men Greece had ever known. But their legacy rose with the next dawn and has not set since. The pass of Thermopylae returned to quiet after the Persians marched south. The bodies were eventually buried or burned. The blood washed away with autumn rains. The thermal springs continued to bubble up from the earth, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded nearby. But the memory remained, and the memory became more powerful than any physical monument. It became a story that every Greek child learned. It became a standard against which courage was measured. It became proof that ordinary men, when committed to something larger than themselves, can achieve extraordinary things. If you visit Thermopylae today, you will find a monument to Leonidas, the Spartan king who chose death over dishonor. You will find a memorial to the Thespians, who made the same choice. You will see the hill where they made their last stand, though erosion and time have altered its shape. You will stand where thousands of Persians and hundreds of Greeks fought and died in the heat of August 2,500 years ago. And if you close your eyes and let the wind carry away the sounds of modern traffic, you might almost hear the clash of bronze on bronze, the war cries in strange languages, the steady rhythm of the phalanx holding its ground. The echoes of those 3 days still linger there, faint but unmistakable, a reminder that this ground was once the frontier between civilizations, the line that could not be crossed, the place where a handful of men said no to an empire and paid for that defiance with their lives. That is the story of Thermopylae. Not just a battle, but a statement. Not just a defeat, but a victory of a different kind. Not just history, but legend. And like all the best legends, it is rooted in truth. Men really did stand in that pass. They really did hold back the Persian army for 3 days. They really did fight to the death rather than surrender. And their sacrifice really did change the course of history. 2,500 years later, we still tell their story. We still honor their memory. We still find inspiration in their example. Because Thermopylae reminds us that numbers do not always determine the outcome. That courage and conviction can overcome material disadvantage. That the manner of our dying can echo louder than the fact of our death. Let us step back now and consider the broader context of what came after, because the story of Thermopylae does not end with the fall of the pass. It continues through the events that followed, events that were shaped and enabled by those 3 days of fighting. When Xerxes marched south from Thermopylae, he found central Greece largely undefended. The Greek strategy had always been to hold the pass long enough to prepare the next phase of resistance, and that next phase centered on the navy. While Leonidas fought at Thermopylae, the Greek fleet had been engaged with the Persian fleet at Artemisium, the straits near the northern tip of Euboea. The naval battle had been inconclusive, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage, but when news came that Thermopylae had fallen, the Greek fleet withdrew south. There was no point in holding Artemisium if the Persian army could simply march around by land. The Greeks fell back to the island of Salamis, just off the coast from Athens. This was a desperate moment. The Persian army was advancing. Athens itself would have to be abandoned. The Athenian assembly made the agonizing decision to evacuate the city. Women, children, and the elderly were sent to the Peloponnese or to nearby islands. The men of fighting age boarded the Athenian fleet, which was the largest contingent in the Greek navy. Athens would be defended not by walls or soldiers, but by ships and sailors. It was a radical strategy, based on an oracle from Delphi that had advised the Athenians to trust in their wooden walls. Most interpreted this to mean the fleet rather than the old wooden palisade that had once protected the Acropolis. When the Persians reached Athens in September 480 BC, they found it nearly empty. A few holdouts remained on the Acropolis, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Xerxes ordered the city burned. The temples on the Acropolis, including an early temple to Athena, went up in flames. The houses in the lower city were torched. Smoke rose over Attica, visible for miles, a column of destruction that must have been heartbreaking for the Athenians watching from Salamis. But the burning of Athens did not break Greek resistance. If anything, it hardened it. The Athenians now had nothing left to lose. Their city was gone. Their only hope was the fleet. The Greek commanders debated what to do next. Some argued for withdrawing to the Isthmus of Corinth, fortifying it, and making a last stand there. But the Athenian commander, Themistocles, argued passionately for staying at Salamis and forcing a naval battle in the narrow straits. Themistocles understood that the Greek fleet's only advantage was maneuverability and the quality of their sailors. In open water, the larger Persian fleet would overwhelm them, but in the confined space of the straits, the Persian numbers would work against them, and Greek tactics could prevail. It was the same logic as Thermopylae, using geography to negate numerical superiority. After much argument, Themistocles convinced the other commanders, though it required trickery and manipulation to keep the fleet from scattering. The Battle of Salamis took place in late September 480 BC, probably around the 20th or 21st of the month. Xerxes watched from a throne set up on a hillside overlooking the straits, confident that his fleet would crush the Greeks and end the war. But what he witnessed instead was disaster. The Persian ships, crowded into the narrow waters, collided with each other, lost formation, and were picked apart by the more agile Greek triremes. The Greeks used their bronze rams to devastating effect, punching holes in Persian hulls and sinking ship after ship. By the end of the day, the Persian fleet was shattered. Hundreds of ships were lost, thousands of sailors drowned, and Xerxes, watching from his throne, realized that his invasion had failed. The King of Kings made a crucial decision. He would return to Persia, leaving behind a substantial army under Mardonius to continue the campaign, but taking the majority of his forces with him. Some historians believe he feared the Greeks might sail to the Hellespont and destroy the bridges, trapping him in Europe. Others think he simply lost the will to continue after the shocking defeat at Salamis. Whatever his reasons, Xerxes departed, and with him went the psychological weight of his presence. The Persian army that remained in Greece was still formidable, perhaps numbering around 50,000 men, but it was no longer the overwhelming force that had crossed the Hellespont in the spring. The next summer, in 479 BC, that Persian army under Mardonius made one final attempt to conquer Greece. They reoccupied Athens, which had been reoccupied and then abandoned again by the Greeks. Mardonius tried to negotiate, offering Athens favorable terms if they would switch sides and join Persia. The Athenians refused. The Spartans, who had been slow to mobilize, finally sent their full army north under the regent Pausanias. The Greeks assembled the largest army they had ever fielded, drawing contingents from all across the Hellenic League. The two armies met at Plataea, a city in Boeotia, in August or September of 479 BC. The Battle of Plataea was the largest land battle of the Persian Wars. The exact numbers are disputed, but the Greeks may have fielded around 40,000 hoplites, including 5,000 Spartans, plus tens of thousands of light troops. The Persians were probably similar in number. The battle was hard fought and chaotic, with the Greek allies nearly breaking apart due to poor coordination. But in the end, Greek discipline prevailed. The Spartans, fighting with the same phalanx tactics that had worked at Thermopylae, but now with superior numbers, broke through the Persian lines and killed Mardonius. His death caused the Persian army to disintegrate. Thousands were killed in the rout. The survivors fled north, back toward Persia, and they never returned. Greece was free. On the same day as Plataea, according to tradition, the Greek fleet won another decisive victory at Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor, destroying what remained of the Persian fleet, and liberating the Ionian Greeks from Persian rule. The twin victories of Plataea and Mycale marked the end of the Persian threat to Greece. The invasion that had begun with such confidence in 480 BC ended in complete failure. Persia would never again attempt to conquer mainland Greece. The Greeks had won their independence, and in doing so, they had preserved their culture, their freedom, and their way of life. And at the heart of that victory was Thermopylae. The 3 days that Leonidas and his men bought with their lives had given the Greeks time to prepare, time to organize, time to fall back to positions where they could fight effectively. The moral boost from the Spartan stand had kept the Greek alliance together when it might have fractured. The proof that Persians could be fought and killed had given courage to Greek soldiers at Salamis and Plataea. Without Thermopylae, it is entirely possible that the Greeks would have lost heart, that the alliance would have collapsed, that Athens would have made terms with Persia, that Sparta would have retreated behind the isthmus and let the rest of Greece fall. But Thermopylae had shown that resistance was not futile, and that lesson carried through the entire war. The years following the Persian Wars saw Greece enter its golden age. Athens rebuilt, grander than before, with Pericles overseeing the construction of the Parthenon and other monuments that still stand today. Democracy flourished. Philosophy, drama, art, and science reached heights that would influence human civilization for millennia. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Euripides, Herodotus, Thucydides, all these figures emerged in the generations after the Persian Wars, and their work was possible because Greece remained free. The culture that produced the foundations of Western philosophy, drama, and political thought was preserved by the men who fought at Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea. Sparta, too, emerged from the Persian Wars with its reputation enhanced. The Spartan military system, always respected, now became legendary. Other Greek states looked to Sparta for military leadership, and for a time, Sparta dominated Greek politics. But Spartan culture was also frozen by its own success. The Spartans became convinced that their way of doing things was perfect, that any change would weaken them. Over the following century, Sparta would become increasingly rigid and conservative, unable to adapt to changing circumstances, until eventually it declined in power and relevance. But in the immediate aftermath of the Persian Wars, Sparta stood at the height of its prestige, and Leonidas was the symbol of everything Sparta represented. The memory of Thermopylae was preserved not just in Sparta, but throughout Greece. Every year, the Spartans held commemorations of the battle. Monuments were erected, not just at the battlefield itself, but in Sparta and elsewhere. The epitaph by Simonides, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws we lie," became one of the most famous pieces of poetry in Greek literature. It captured perfectly the Spartan ethos, the idea that duty to the state and obedience to law were the highest virtues worth dying for. The epitaph also served as a subtle reminder to other Greeks of what Sparta had sacrificed for the common defense. It was propaganda, but effective propaganda, because it was grounded in truth. Herodotus, the historian who wrote the most detailed ancient account of the Persian Wars, visited Thermopylae and spoke to survivors and witnesses. His account, while not perfect and certainly including some mythologizing, is remarkably detailed and forms the basis of our knowledge of the battle. Herodotus understood that Thermopylae was significant, not just as a military engagement, but as a story that revealed something fundamental about Greek culture. He spent considerable time in his narrative building up to the battle, explaining the context, describing the personalities involved, and then giving a blow-by-blow account of the fighting. His description of the feigned retreats, the struggle over Leonidas's body, the final stand on the hill, these became canonical versions of events that all later writers drew upon. But Herodotus also made sure to mention the other Greeks who fought at Thermopylae, not just the Spartans. He praised the Thespians for staying when they could have left. He noted the contributions of the Phocians and Locrians. He even mentioned individuals by name, preserving their memory when they might otherwise have been forgotten. This was important because the story of Thermopylae could easily have become just a Spartan story, erasing the contributions of others. Herodotus, to his credit, tried to give a fuller picture, even if his sources were imperfect, and his own biases sometimes showed through. Later, Greek historians and writers continued to reference Thermopylae as a touchstone. When Plutarch wrote his biographical sketches of famous Greeks and Romans, he included Leonidas and devoted space to describing the Spartan way of life that produced such warriors. Plutarch collected sayings attributed to Spartan kings and soldiers, many of them probably apocryphal, but illustrative of Spartan values. One famous exchange supposedly occurred when Xerxes sent a message to Leonidas, demanding that the Greeks surrender their weapons. Leonidas's reply was two words in Greek, mol and lab, which translates to, "Come and take them." Whether he actually said this or not, the phrase became a rallying cry for defiance against overwhelming force. It is still used today in various contexts, particularly by those who see themselves as defending freedom against tyranny. The Romans, when they conquered Greece and absorbed Greek culture, also absorbed the story of Thermopylae. Roman writers like Cicero and Plutarch held up the Spartans as examples of virtue and martial excellence. Roman soldiers were taught about Thermopylae as a lesson in discipline and courage. The Roman military virtues of duty, honor, and self-sacrifice found a mirror in the Spartan ethos, and Thermopylae became part of the shared cultural heritage of the Greco-Roman world. This meant that when the Roman Empire eventually split and transformed into the various kingdoms and states of medieval and early modern Europe, the story of Thermopylae came with it. During the Renaissance, when European scholars rediscovered and translated Greek texts, Thermopylae once again captured imagination. Artists painted scenes from the battle. Writers composed poems and plays about it. Political philosophers invoked Leonidas and the 300 when arguing about the nature of citizenship, duty, and republican virtue. The story fit perfectly into Renaissance ideals about the noble sacrifice of free citizens defending their republic against despotic empires. It was no accident that some of the American founding fathers, educated in classical literature, would have known the story of Thermopylae and drawn inspiration from it when they themselves were resisting what they saw as tyranny. In the modern era, Thermopylae has been invoked in countless contexts. During World War I, soldiers in the trenches read about ancient battles to try to make sense of their own experiences. During World War II, Winston Churchill referenced Thermopylae when speaking about British resistance to Nazi Germany, drawing explicit parallels between the Persian invasion of Greece and the German invasion of Europe. When Greece itself was invaded by Italy and then Germany in 1940 and 1941, Greek soldiers consciously evoked the memory of Thermopylae, and a British Commonwealth force even fought a delaying action at the same pass, holding long enough for Allied forces to evacuate to Crete. The symbolism was powerful and deliberate. In the Cold War era, Thermopylae was invoked by those who saw themselves as defenders of freedom against totalitarianism. The idea of a small free nation standing against a massive authoritarian empire resonated in the context of the West versus the Soviet Union. And in more recent times, the story has been retold in various media, each generation finding in Thermopylae something that speaks to their own concerns and values. Sometimes the emphasis is on military tactics and strategy. Sometimes it is on themes of sacrifice and duty. Sometimes it is on the clash of civilizations. The story is flexible enough to accommodate many interpretations, which is part of why it endures. But we should be careful not to lose sight of the human reality beneath the symbolism. Thermopylae was not just an abstract clash of ideas. It was 3 days of brutal, exhausting, terrifying combat. Men died in agony, pierced by spears, struck by arrows, crushed under falling bodies, gasping out their last breaths on blood-soaked ground under the August sun. The wounded screamed and begged for water. The dying called out for their mothers or their gods. War, even glorious war, even war fought for the noblest cause, is still hell. The men at Thermopylae were heroes, yes, but they were also victims of war, and we should not romanticize their suffering even as we honor their courage. Consider what it must have been like for a young Spartan, perhaps 20 years old, standing in the phalanx on the 3rd day. He has been fighting for 2 days already. He is exhausted beyond anything he experienced in training. His muscles ache. His throat is parched despite drinking from the hot springs. His shield arm feels like lead. The bronze of his helmet has rubbed his skin raw. He has seen friends die, has heard their screams, has felt their blood spray across his face. He knows the Persians have found the mountain path. He knows there is no escape. He knows that in a few hours he will be dead. And yet, when Leonidas gives the order to advance, he steps forward. He locks his shield with the man next to him. He levels his spear, and he marches toward the Persian line, toward certain death, because his king commands it, and because to do otherwise would be unthinkable. That young man is a hero, but he is also a human being, and he is afraid, and he does it anyway. That is what courage looks like. Or consider a Persian soldier, a conscript from some distant province of the empire, who does not even speak the same language as most of his fellow soldiers. He has marched for months to reach this place. He does not particularly want to conquer Greece. He has no personal grievance against the Greeks. He is here because his satrap ordered his village to provide troops, and refusal would have meant punishment for his entire family. He is standing in line, waiting his turn to advance into the pass, and he can see the bodies of the men who went before him piled up ahead. He knows his chances of survival are not good, but he steps forward when ordered, because what else can he do? He is not a monster. He is a man caught in the machinery of war, and he will die far from home for reasons he does not fully understand. The Persians at Thermopylae were enemies of the Greeks, yes, but they were also human beings, most of them ordinary people swept up in events beyond their control. This is the tragedy of war. It takes ordinary people and puts them in extraordinary situations where they must kill or be killed, where courage and terror exist side by side, where the line between heroism and horror becomes blurred. Thermopylae was a great moment in history, but it was also a terrible one. Thousands died there. Families lost fathers and sons. Children grew up without parents. Communities were emptied of their young men. The victory that came later, at Salamis and Plataea, was worth it in the sense that it preserved Greek freedom and culture. But it came at a price, and we should not forget the human cost, even as we celebrate the triumph. There is also the question of what Thermopylae means for us today. What can a battle fought 2,500 years ago teach us about our own world? The easy answer is that it teaches us about courage, about standing up for what we believe in, even when the odds are against us. And there is truth in that. But we should be careful about drawing simplistic lessons from complex historical events. The world of 480 BC was very different from our world. The values that guided Leonidas and his Spartans are not necessarily values we would or should embrace today. Spartan society was built on conquest, slavery, and a brutal military culture that crushed individuality in favor of collective strength. The freedom the Greeks were defending was not freedom as we understand it today. It was the freedom of male citizens to participate in their city-state's governance, but it excluded women, slaves, and foreigners. The democracy of Athens, for all its achievements, was a democracy only for a minority of its population. So we should not idealize the ancient Greeks or imagine them as perfect exemplars of virtue. They were people of their time, with values shaped by their particular historical and cultural context. What we can take from Thermopylae, though, is something more universal. The idea that there are moments when we must choose between what is easy and what is right. The recognition that sometimes the most important victories are not the ones where we win, but the ones where we stand and fight even when we know we will lose. The understanding that our actions, our choices, our willingness to sacrifice, these things matter and can have consequences that ripple forward through time in ways we cannot predict. Leonidas could not have known that his stand at Thermopylae would be remembered for thousands of years. He could not have known that his name would become synonymous with courage and sacrifice. He made his choice based on the circumstances of his moment, the values of his culture, and his own sense of duty. He probably thought he was simply doing what had to be done, what any Spartan king would do in his position. But the consequences of his choice extended far beyond anything he could have imagined. Because he stood at Thermopylae, the Greek alliance held together. Because the Greek alliance held together, Greece survived. Because Greece survived, Greek culture flourished. And because Greek culture flourished, it shaped the development of Western civilization in profound and lasting ways. One man's choice to stand and fight in a narrow pass in 480 BC helped determine the course of the next 2,000 years of human history. That is the power of Thermopylae. Not that it was a military victory, because it was not, but that it was a moral statement so powerful that it changed what people believed was possible. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Thermopylae. That belief matters. That the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we are capable of, these stories shape reality as surely as material forces do. The Greeks believed that free men could defeat the armies of an empire, and because they believed it, they made it true. The Spartans believed that dying with honor was preferable to living with shame, and because they believed it, they created a legacy that outlasted their own civilization. We may not share all their values, we may not want to replicate their society, but we can recognize that their example, for all its complications and contradictions, speaks to something fundamental about the human experience. The desire to matter, the need to believe that our lives have meaning, the hope that when we are faced with impossible choices, we will have the courage to do what we believe is right. Thermopylae reminds us that we are not powerless, that even when the odds are overwhelming, even when defeat seems certain, our choices still matter. How we face adversity, how we respond to injustice, how we stand up for what we believe in, these things define us. Not the outcome, but the choice itself. Leonidas and the 300 chose to stand and fight. They chose duty over survival. They chose to be remembered as men who did not yield. And in making that choice, they gave meaning not just to their own lives, but to the lives of all the Greeks who came after them, who fought on knowing that surrender was not inevitable, that resistance was possible, that freedom was worth any price. The sun has set countless times over the pass of Thermopylae since that August day in 480 BC. The hot springs still bubble up from the earth. The mountains still rise steeply to the south. The sea still laps at the northern edge of the pass, though the coastline has shifted. The narrow place where Leonidas stood is wider now, changed by time and geology. But the memory remains, the story endures. And as long as human beings continue to face moments when they must choose between safety and principle, between surrender and resistance, between the easy path and the right path, the story of Thermopylae will continue to resonate. Because it reminds us that the greatest victories are not always the ones where we win, but the ones where we refuse to quit, where we stand our ground, where we prove that some things matter more than survival. 300 Spartans stood in a pass and held back an empire. 700 Thespians stood with them and shared their fate. Thousands of other Greeks fought and died there over 3 days in the late summer heat. They did not stop Persia. They did not win the battle, but they won something more important. They won the belief that Persia could be stopped. And that belief, carried forward by the survivors, by the Greek army at Salamis, by the Allied forces at Plataea, that belief became reality. Greece was saved. The West was born. And all of it traces back, in part, to 3 days in a narrow pass, where a small group of men decided that they would not move, would not yield, would not surrender. That is Thermopylae. That is its legacy. That is why, 25 centuries later, we still tell the story. Not because it is the story of a victory, but because it is the story of a stand. A moment when men faced the impossible and chose not to run. A moment when courage proved stronger than numbers. A moment when the few taught the many that freedom is never given. It must be taken. It must be defended. It must be paid for in blood and sacrifice. And sometimes, in the narrow places where geography and fate intersect, a handful of the brave can change the course of history by simply refusing to step aside. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most legendary last stands, please hit that subscribe button and join us as we explore more moments when ordinary people faced extraordinary challenges and chose courage over comfort. There are so many more stories waiting to be told, so many more battles and decisions and moments that shaped our world. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.